The Iranian Revolutionary Guard says that its officers are providing consultation services to the Syrian regime, and al-Hashimi says that Iraq is now part of Iran.
Thousands of militia now inside Syria, supporting.
Brahimi leaves Syria after an internet dialogue with the Free Syrian Army officials, and Lihbous says that there is no need for a treaty.
اسقاط النظام اولا بالقوه ونحن قادرون ان شاء الله على ذلك.
And also in the news, new massacres are committed in Aleppo and Idlib, raising the death toll today to more than 115. Welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. Reuters news agency reported that the commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, Major General Mohammad Ali Jafari, saying that the members of the Revolutionary Guards are in Syria to provide non-military aid, although Iran may engage militarily there in Syria if Syria came under attack. This statement is the first Iranian official recognition from a senior military commander that Iran has a military presence in Syria. Iraq's Vice President Tariq al-Hashimi accused the Prime Minister of Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki, of being an international terrorist who turned Iraq into a corridor for Iran and its militias that are being sent to Syria.
My country, unfortunately, becoming an Iranian corridor to support the autocratic regime of Bashar al-Assad. There is no doubt about it. It's not only the airspace. It is thousands of militia now inside Syria supporting Bashar al-Assad and killing the Syrian innocent people, smuggling and providing ammunition and armament is ongoing. This is the report which I received from Anbar province, which is very close to Syrian border. I do have also a connection to the Syrian opposition. They report to me, even they already arrested, in fact, many of the Iraqi militias inside.
A number of Syrian judges announced establishing a council called the Free Syrian Judicial Council, which includes judges who are defected from the Syrian regime. The council aims to communicate with military councils for the formation of committees to secure the courts in the liberated areas, the reorganization of the judiciary system, and to ensure its independence in order to build a state of law and institutions, as the council will organize the transition and development of the infrastructure for the post-Assad period. An official German newspaper said that Syria has carried out experiments of poison gas bombs during August, and quoted an unnamed witnesses saying that several bombs were fired from tanks and aircraft in the desert near Al-Safira in Aleppo. It is also worth mentioning that a Center for Chemical Weapons Research is positioned near the area, and according to the newspaper, the regime carries out many experiments and production of chemical weapons under the supervision of Iranian officers. The UN and Arab envoy left Damascus after a 3-day tour. Brahimi also held a dialogue via Skype with a number of leaders of military councils in Syria, including the colonels Abdul Jabbar Agedi in Aleppo and Khalid Lihbous in Damascus, in addition to Qasim Sa'duddin in Homs. Brahimi said that he did not yet form a plan to resolve the crisis, but is still in process of listening to local and international sides. This comes after Brahimi arrived in Damascus on Thursday and met with Syrian dissidents, in addition to the Syrian president and the foreign minister Walid Muallim.
وأكرر أيضا أن هذه الأزمة تتفاقم.
In a meeting with Orient News, Colonel Khalid Lihbous, the chairman of the Military Council in Damascus, said that the Military Council officers asked the UN envoy to work towards stopping the killing and destruction caused by al-Assad's regime. Moving to the situation on ground, and al-Assad regime forces and artillery aircraft shelled the neighborhoods of Al-Sakhur, Al-Sha'ar, Tariq al-Bab, Masakin Hanano in Aleppo. Meanwhile, activists reported that the eastern districts of Aleppo are suffering heavily from the military bombardment. To that, violent clashes in the surrounding Al-Hal market and Al-Bustan al-Qasr amid heavy fight of regime's helicopters over the city.
الله أكبر حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل.
Meanwhile, activists broadcasted this morning images of the bombing and destruction that targeted the city of Al-Bab in Aleppo.
الله أكبر يقي الآخر يقي برميل آخر.
The regime's military operations continued on the countryside of Aleppo that led to the displacement of residents from their cities and towns. More in the following report.
Empty streets and devastated buildings are the common scene in the alleys and streets of Aleppo. And Aleppo province became empty after the displacement of its citizens amid fear of rocket strikes on the neighborhoods. Most young men joined battalions of the brigades of the Free Syrian Army and swore to defend their towns and other Syrian cities until martyrdom or victory. And in conjunction with the arrival of the Arab Observers Committee, the regime began their military operations on the northern countryside, and specifically on the city of Tel Rifat, that has 40,000 citizens, and it's still suffering the regime strikes. The town of Hayyan was also targeted by indiscriminate shelling that destroyed houses and shops, and the rest of the people who stayed in Aleppo do not have a solution to the crisis that happened to them and their own town. The regime's military operations prompted residents to flee towards the Turkish territories and the agricultural fields, waiting for the time when the regime falls and they can go back to their cities and towns.
Activists said that they spotted cluster bombs during the regime's bombing on the city of Saraqib in the countryside of Idlib. Meanwhile, the city has witnessed a violent bombardment that led to the destruction of residential buildings and the death of dozens of victims.
الله أكبر قصف الطيران الحربي 15/9/2012 الله أكبر قصف الطيران الحربي
Meanwhile, the towns and villages in the northern suburbs of Idlib were exposed to bombardment by the regime's warplanes, where both Isqat and Silqin, Kafr Trakharim, witnessed bombardment from the Dhair barrier in Jisr al-Shughur. The villages of Al-Kastan and Mishmshan witnessed heavy shelling, while activists reported explosions that shook the surrounding villages of Jisr al-Shughur. Also, the town al-Bshariya in Jabal al-Zawiya was exposed to military operations that led to widespread destruction in the town.
ومع ذلك فإن الشعب السوري
Over 115 victims fell in Syria today, at a time when 5 million students begin their new year amid escalating military operations. To that, the regime forces killed at least 5 people, a result of heavy shelling on Hajar al-Aswad in the neighborhood of Damascus. While there were reports about finding the bodies of 6 victims who were executed after being arrested yesterday in the neighborhood of Al-Qadam. To that, shelling intensified on Al-Qadam, Al-Asali, At-Tadamun amid raids on houses. The Free Student Union in Damascus organized a student demonstration in At-Tahrir Square that later on marched on to the protest in front of the air intelligence centers in Damascus. Damascus suburbs, there were reports about finding 21 bodies of victims who were executed in the town of Yalda, while shelling renewed on the cities of Zabadani and Douma, amid a campaign of raids and arrests of dozens of civilians in the city of Atal. To that, several victims fell wounded due to tanks shelling on residential neighborhoods in the city of Ma'adamiyat al-Sham, while MiG warplanes bombed the city of Yabrud. Coming up in the bulletin, the regime uses low-cost weapons to bomb civilians. Welcome back. You're watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. Moving on to Hama, where many shells fell on the villages of Harib Nafsa and Talaf amid citizens' fears of possible regime attacks. Meanwhile, many of the city's neighborhoods witnessed shelling from B&B carts, in addition to the fall of bombs on the neighborhoods of Al-Bayyad and Ta'awuniya. To that, the town of Kafr Nabuda witnessed rocket and helicopter bombing that targeted Sahl al-Ghab villages.
Allahu Akbar.
Al-Assad regime forces imposed a suffocating siege on the city of Hama as heavy security spears amid widespread raids of arrests that paralyzed life in the city. More in the following report.
The suffering of the people in Hama began after they confronted al-Assad's regime since Hafez al-Assad took power after a military coup, and continued until the day that massacres swept all Syrian cities and towns. The city of Hama, which is heavily populated with more than 800,000 citizens, is suffering under a crippling blockade imposed by al-Assad regime forces on its 27 neighborhoods, while the regime forces set military barriers and concrete berms to separate its areas after the forces bombarded certain neighborhoods such as Masha'at al-Arba'in. Siege paralyzed life in the city amid citizens' fear that the regime forces might prevent students from reaching their schools with the beginning of the school year, in addition to their fear that the regime forces might shell the schools. The Syrian regime is trying to separate and isolate the city of Hama from its countryside by establishing checkpoints at the entrances in an attempt to cut the rebels' supply route amid fear of the arrival of the revolutionary tide to the loyal towns and villages. Citizens of Hama say that the massacres are happening in front of the world and assert that they are able, despite this silence, to make a change.
During the month of August, the Syrian government has murdered 5,607 Syrian civilians, according to the Syrian Human Rights Network. And the table published includes the name and location of each victim and the perpetrator of the offense, along with a video of each victim. In addition to that, the network said that within the month of August, the Syrian regime's use of warplanes was the most excessive, which caused a large number of civilian casualties, reaching at some days to more than 200. August was also the bloodiest month since the beginning of the uprising, where the numbers of victims were the highest and also the largest and ugliest massacre committed by the regime since the start of the revolution took place during August in Daraya, in Damascus suburbs. Moreover, the Syrian Human Rights Network said that the regime forces killed more than 5,600 civilians during August of this year, in addition to 328 children, 512 women. Meanwhile, 104 citizens were killed under torture, and 81 soldiers were also killed. The United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, announced that more than 2,072 schools have been totally or partially destroyed by the ongoing military operations of the forces of the Syrian regime, while 800 schools host displaced citizens who took shelter in the schools after their homes were destroyed. The UNICEF official spokeswoman, Mary Mercado, said that the organization completed the restoration of 67 schools and they are ready to receive the students, in addition to 100 other schools that will be renovated within weeks, particularly in the areas of Dar'a, Damascus and Latakia. At least, as a last resort, the regime started using poisonous explosive barrels in its bombings, which, according to the reports, means that the Syrian regime is using low-cost weaponry in bombing its own country.
Allahu Akbar.
Explosive barrels and cluster bombs is the regime's latest resort to kill people in Syria. The explosive barrels have a high capacity of destroying vast land since it contains gas, TNT and poisonous materials. One barrel is enough to cause a catastrophic destruction in the targeted areas, which was the case in Deir ez-Zor, Hama, Aleppo, Idlib and Homs that were the first targets of the regime's warplanes and these kinds of explosives. Civilians called the use of explosive barrels by the regime as tragic, as the regime is almost out of weaponry to use, while others confirm that the reason for using this kind of weapons is the cheap cost. These information are not only rumors amongst civilians, it's become recorded facts and the world public opinions and a story that's been discussed by newspaper and media outlets. The Center for Cluster Bombs Coalition that calls for disarming these weapons recorded videos that showed evidence of the bombs being present in the battlefield that killed citizens and resulted in mutilating them.
Allahu Akbar. شظاير توصل لهون ديروا بالكم ها.
Stephen Jones from the Cluster Bomb Center and the Human Rights Watch insisted that these evidences show that the regime forces indeed used cluster bombs against civilians. International Records recently came out to announce its fears that the regime will be using chemical weapons, especially that its violence is increasing against civilians in Syria. This violence did not, however, affect the international community or organizations, except in issuing condemnations and reports.
In Dar'a, at least 10 people were killed following an explosion of a civilian bus on the Damascus-Dar'a road, while shelling continued on Mayadin al-Nasib, which led to the fall of many shells along the heavy fire from the military checkpoints. In the meantime, the villages of Lajat were exposed to artillery bombing, and the town of Busasham came under mortar shelling that targeted the western neighborhood of the city amid widespread security forces in the outskirts of Tariq al-Sad. And at the camps of Dar'a al-Mahatta, and they were exposed to a curfew and a crippling blockade on the civilians. In Homs and its countryside, the military operations continued, where shelling renewed since the early morning hours on the besieged neighborhoods. And activists reported hearing gunfire and clashes in the neighborhood of Al-Wa'ar, which coincided with the arrival of a number of armored vehicles. While in the cities of Talkallakh, Talbisa and Al-Hula, as well as the Rastan, heavy shelling was renewed and many casualties were reported amid random intensive gunfire on passers-by. The Syrian regime continued warplanes and military attacks on Al-Hamidiyya neighborhood in Deir ez-Zor amid a complete disconnection of water and power supply. Violent military operations also continued on Al-Bu Kamal, killing and wounding a number of civilians as they targeted residential and commercial areas. And in the meantime, the residents in the town of Al-Kharita sent distress calls to the international community because of the huge shortage of medical and relief supplies and a notable increase in the number of displaced citizens. In the city of Latakia, and as it falls the semester of the schools, a student protest was taken to the street to support the city and the Free Syrian Army. Meanwhile, in Latakia suburbs, shelling was renewed by the regime forces on the towns and villages of Salma and Durin. In addition to that, the regime dropped many explosive barrels on the city of Mrj, which caused many casualties, including a massive destruction in residential compounds and infrastructure. Furthermore, heavy clashes continued between the regime forces and the Free Army. The regime and its Shabiha forces carried out campaigns of raids and arrests in various neighborhoods in the city of Al-Hasaka, which targeted many men who were born between the years of 1975 and 1993 in order to recruit them into the regime's army. And in another manner, the city of Shadadi in the suburbs of Al-Hasaka was subjected to heavy bombing that coincided with the clashes that occurred between the regime forces and the Free Syrian Army. Before we wrap up, here's another look at today's top stories. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards say that its officers are providing consultation services to Syrian regime, and al-Hashimi says that Iraq is now part of Iran.
Thousands of militia now inside Syria supporting.
Ibrahimi leaves Syria after an internet dialogue with the Free Syrian Army officials, and Al-Habous says that there is no need for a treaty.
اسقاط النظام اولا بالقوه ونحن قادرون ان شاء الله على ذلك.
And a new massacre is committed in Aleppo and another one in Idlib, raising the death toll today to more than 115. With this, we end our news bulletin from Orient TV. Thank you for watching.